Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Jessica Murray, Sierra Club Canada's Ontario Director. A few years ago, Anand Giridharadas wrote a powerful book called The Persuaders, and it talks about the art of persuasion, showcasing activists and organizers from the progressive left, such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders. At the core, the book pushes to inspire readers to keep seeing the other as persuadable. And in this age of misinformation, where it is too easy to find ourselves judging those who have beliefs unlike our own as irredeemable, I am happy to share that the evidence points to something more gracious. There are ways to reach out to others to bring them back, and it is based on the shared belief and value that no one wants to be made a fool. And so today I'm talking with John Cook, who is a cognitive behavior scientist featured in Anand's book, The Persuaders. John's work revolves around countering misinformation within the climate change realm through inoculation theory. If we view misinformation like a virus, then John's work is towards a vaccine. Through exposing the population with a weakened version of misinformation, the mind then builds a general resistance to the virus of misinformation. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular new updates you can sign up for on our homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. Here we go. Hello there. How are you doing, John?
I'm well, thanks.
You're over in Australia, so thanks so much for meeting with me virtually. 8 a.m. in the morning for you?
Yes, 8 a.m.'s pretty normal. I do a lot of US meetings, so I'm used to
Okay.
having meetings at this time of day.
Okay. How's your morning starting off?
Yeah, just had breakfast and a coffee, so I'm good to go.
That's great. So I want to dive right into it.
Sure.
So first of all, again, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I absolutely loved Anand Giridharadas's book. I loved the chapter that featured you, and I can't wait to kind of share what you've been up to with some of our listeners. So I wanted to start with your personal story because I thought it was quite interesting how you actually kind of meandered through life to come to becoming a cognitive behavior scientist. So can you tell me just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, meander is a good description
Yeah.
because I started studying physics at the University of Queensland, and then after my physics degree, then I took a very abrupt career change into cartooning. Possibly because I spent a bit of time during my physics lectures doodling cartoons in my lecture notes and did that for about a decade or so. But while I was cartooning, I found myself getting back into science and getting interested in science again, particularly climate science, and started a website, skepticalscience.com, which was debunking climate misinformation, really just as a hobby. So essentially, my career began as doing science and cartooning as a hobby. Then I went to cartooning, doing science as a hobby. Then I got dragged back into science again. The Skeptical Science website grew and grew to the point where I ended up starting a PhD in the psychology of climate misinformation. And that eventually led to me synthesizing both tracks, like using cartoons and humor to tackle misinformation about climate change.
I love that. And I think these days we're seeing so much more of kind of this concept of intersectionality where, people are multifaceted. You're an artist, you're a scientist, you're also so many things, right? So I love seeing that. And I think that's such a healthy direction for all of us. And I think to pick off of your personal story, at some point you have skepticalscience.com, and then you had this realization about misinformation. So kind of like help us go along your story. What did you discover that I don't even know if everybody knows this about misinformation and what's effective to actually tackle it.
Yeah, I began the Skeptical Science website debunking misinformation from the background of someone who had studied physics, had a physical science background, but knew nothing about the psychology of debunking or communication principles. I was just trying to communicate the facts. And a couple of years into skeptical science, I received an email from a cognitive scientist, Stefan Lewandowski, who emailed me some psychology research testing different types of debunkings and finding that if you debunked misinformation in the wrong way, you could actually cause a backfire effect and reinforce the myth rather than reduce belief in the myth. And what was a real eye-opener for me was realizing that the bad way of debunking was the same way that skeptical science was debunking misinformation. So
Yeah.
I was having this kind of reading this paper, blood draining from my face, thinking, "Oh my God, have I been making things worse?" But
Right.
I will put a qualifier that while that initial shock about the backfire effect really grabbed my attention and it really changed my life, it set me on the path of studying psychology and doing psychology research myself. In the decade and a half since that time, psychology researchers have really struggled to replicate the backfire effect to the point where in 2020, I co-authored the debunking handbook with about 2 dozen misinformation researchers. And we basically come to the conclusion that backfires are rare and the greater
Oh.
danger is leaving misinformation unchallenged. So,
Oh, interesting.
mm,
So this is actually kind of like Anand Giridharadas' book, The Persuaders, is actually an incomplete story in some ways, because now it sounds like what you're saying is that actually addressing the misinformation is important. Is that right? Did I hear that right?
yeah, oh, it definitely is important. Yes, so the journey never stops. So
Yes, and that's
I think I spoke to an and that would have been 2017. I think I spoke to him and he wrote that chapter about my research. And yeah, so that was a couple of years before the debugging handbook and before we really got a clearer picture of backfires are out there, but they're just so rare that they're not the boogeyman that we thought they were. And it is really important that we do challenge and counter misinformation.
okay. So then I'm kind of curious because I feel like there's a lot of good science already out there. Like there's a lot of narratives about all the science that is out there, that climate change is happening. And even I think recently we saw a report, at least in Canada, come out that the fossil fuel industry has been underreporting the emissions. So it's actually over 6,000% more. So then what are we missing here? Because it still seems like, or is it more like people agree it's happening, but now the issue is more, at least within the climate change reality. I can't speak to misinformation and other topics, but at least within climate change, it sounds like, do you think that everybody mostly agrees at this point then?
So public opinion about climate change has been shifting.
Hmm.
Yale and George Mason University do these big, like nationally representative surveys a couple of times a year. And they've been doing that for over a decade. And they're seeing that on every measure, the public is moving towards more accepting that climate change is real, more accepting that humans are causing it, that the impacts will be bad, and more supportive for climate action. So the public is shifting towards, yes, it's real and we need to do something about it. When you look at climate misinformation itself, you do see different arguments. Some of them are science-based, arguing it's not real, it's not human-caused. Some of them are solutions-based, arguing that the solutions are harmful or won't work. Or they're just attacking scientists or attacking climate science itself, trying to undermine public trust in climate change and climate science. But all of these arguments have the same goal, which is delay climate action and delay efforts to switch from fossil fuel burning to renewable energy. And so, what we found in our research is that when you look over the last 20 years, climate misinformation has been shifting. The arguments are shifting from the science denial arguments, it's not real, it's not us, towards the solutions type arguments. So they're essentially making a strategic retreat from science denial to solutions denial
See.
because the science is becoming undeniable, and the public are getting more on board with accepting the reality of climate change. But the
That's
goal
so
is still the
fast.
same. They're still about delaying climate action.
That's so fascinating. So I think I wonder if I've come across one, and I'd be curious to know what your thought is. So I recently had a conversation with somebody that has worked as a solar engineer for years, and he works with a US based company. And he says that a good number of industry leaders within renewables believe that there's this kind of like question of the last 10%. So like, yes, we could get like 90% renewable, but then what are we going to do about that last 10%? Like kind of like the idea of like, oh, well, what if the heat pumps don't work? What if there is no wind or what if there is no solar somewhere? And I mean, there's all other kind of, I think, challenges to kind of building out the grid and transmission line so that renewables is flexible and able to kind of meet that 100%. But what is your thought on that last 10% question? Because I thought a decade ago, there was already research showing that 100% renewables was possible. And so it's interesting to see, even within kind of, I guess engineers aren't quite scientists, but they are kind of professionals, hopefully kind of talking to each other. So I'm curious to know your opinion as to what's going on there.
Yeah, and well, firstly, you raise a good point about engineers versus scientists, because once we start getting into these technical questions, we're getting outside of the basic climate science questions where climate scientists are the relevant experts, and we're getting into more difficult questions. So that's
Mm,
another reason why I think that misinformation is transitioning to solutions, because it is often more nuanced, more difficult. There are good faith debates going on there, whereas on questions like human-caused global warming, the debate isn't good faith. It's their science was settled decades ago. So firstly, I think that and the experts different in this case, because engineers and people who are building renewable technologies and implementing them, they're relevant experts in this case. So
hmm
it's a much it's a I'm finding because I've been working in the science misinformation field, mostly focusing on that. But finding
hmm
that solutions is the future of climate misinformation is forcing me to have to learn about solutions more. And it's a more challenging subject because it's not as cut and dry. The science isn't as settled as it has been with climate science. So so I don't really have clear-cut answers to those kind of questions. It's often contextual. It depends on different countries have different situations. They have different energy mixes. One
hmm
country like Western Canada, British Columbia will have a lot of their energy coming from dams and hydro. And then other countries like Australia, we have a lot of coastline where we can draw on wind energy. So I wish I had a good answer to that, but it's not something that I have much expertise on yet.
Yeah, and I'm also just continuing to learn as well. So I think the qualifier for this idea of 100% renewable is that it could only happen if the grids could share energy at all points. And looking at that, that would mean to me so far in my research a couple things. So one, that we would need much more transmission lines to make that happen. So there's a bit of a I mean, even when we look at solar and wind, there is still that kind of local resistance. Like I think change is just hard for all human beings, and maybe that's something we can kind of come back to from your perspective. But yeah, like there's kind of this pushback, like, oh well, I don't want it in my backyard, right? I don't want to be looking at the transmission line. I don't like the way that the spinning windmill is looking. All sorts of things like that. And then there's kind of the reality of those pre-existing contracts that are not made to allow for such a flexible grid where we can be trading so freely on a maybe global scale. So to me, those are kind of like the larger questions that ends up, like you say, like kind of leaving the world of climate scientists and more kind of with the practicalities of like, well, how do we do this and what's in the way? And I'm curious to know what your thought is, where your role as a cognitive behavioral scientist is with kind of where we're at now, I guess, in the story.
My role has focused on using critical thinking to understand how the misinformation arguments mislead and distract people from the most important points. And the practical way that I do that is by exposing the misleading techniques, the logical fallacies used to mislead. So let's apply that to this situation. Generally, I think that the fallacy involved with these types of arguments tends to be impossible expectations. It would
Right.
be saying that if renewables can't get us 100% of the way now, then we should wait until we have solved that problem before we embark. No, we need to
Sure.
embark now. We need to
Right.
be making that transition and then figuring out that last 10% along the way. Often these arguments are used to try to delay the transition, but we need to be transitioning as quickly as possible and reducing our emissions as quickly as possible. If we get 90% of the way, that's a lot better than not making the transition.
Sure. Yeah, and we're not at 90% anyway, so let's at least get there first, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's a perfect segue into Cranky Uncle, which is how I
Mhm.
kind of reached out to you, and I've downloaded the app. It's wonderful. I'm hoping to kind of integrate it in some of the grassroots organizing that we'll be doing in Ontario. So I would love to hear more about like kind of what any learnings from as you've seen that kind of unroll. I've seen it kind of launch in different languages, different parts of the world. So let's talk about Cranky Uncle. And then also, I think it'd be great to kind of run through your five kind of categories for discovering misinformation.
Yeah, so Cranky Uncle it really came out of my research. And my research began like a lot of scientific research begins, like just starting with a scientific question. In my case, what are effective ways to counter misinformation? And I ran experiments, psychology experiments, testing different ways to respond to misinformation, and found that explaining the techniques used in misinformation was really effective. Psychology researchers call this inoculation. You are basically exposing people to a weakened form of misinformation in the same way that a vaccine exposes people to a weakened version of a virus. That builds up their immunity so that they're less likely to be infected. If you expose people to a weakened form of misinformation, in other words, explaining how it misleads people, that builds up their cognitive immunity so that they're less likely to be misled. And once I had that technique, then the question was, well, how do you put that into practice, particularly in a scalable way? Because misinformation is such a big issue that, and it's so ubiquitous, we need to be able to reach big chunks of the population. We're not going to get everyone enrolling in critical thinking classes at university, and I don't have time to go and talk to every person in the population. But it was just really, I think, chance that I happened to meet a games developer at a misinformation conference in Washington, D.C. We started talking, collaborating, and then started developing the idea of Cranky Uncle. So the idea of the game is explaining the techniques of misinformation, using a cartoon character, Cranky Uncle, as a way to make it visual and humorous, to more engaging, and then using the elements of games to really incentivize players to keep playing, to get further into the game, collect points, level up, practice critical thinking, practice spotting misinformation techniques. And the further they got into the game, the more inoculated they become or against misinformation, or in other words, the better they get at spotting misinformation techniques. And yeah, we released the Cranky Uncle game. When was it? It was in 2020, I think December. So it was right in the middle of the pandemic.
Wow. Great time for games to be launching too, as we were turning to our screens to stay connected.
Yeah.
And I know that there was a movement for the game to make it into schools, and I think that's so wonderful because, of course, we really want to be protecting kind of the future minds of tomorrow, right? And so I'm curious to know how it did in school settings.
When we first launched the game, I embedded research in the game so you could measure how good people's critical thinking was at the start of the game and then at the end of the game, hoping to measure whether the game improved their critical thinking. But the first early adopters of the game were getting near perfect scores at the start of the game. And I realized these are just all the people who follow me on Twitter and and are already engaged with the issue of misinformation and critical thinking. And I realized we need to be reaching a different audience other than Twitter followers. And so I developed a teacher's guide to Cranky Uncle and started promoting it to educators, hoping that teachers would start using it in their classrooms and they would reach students. And what happened then was, yeah, we were quite surprised at how widely adopted the game was. Not only geographically, like in the US, I think it's been adopted in over 40 states. So, it's very much red state and blue state parts
Amazing.
of the country, as well as now it's being translated into other languages across a whole number of other countries. So geographically, it's had a wide reach. But what has also surprised me is both the age and the classes that have been using it. I initially thought it would probably be maybe senior high school or undergrad university, but we found that students have been using the game in classrooms from elementary school all the way to grad classes. It's
Oh,
kind of amazing
wow.
that that one game is being used at such a wide age range. And also, I thought the game would mostly be used in climate change classes or environmental science because although the game is generally critical thinking, there was an emphasis on climate misinformation because that's been my research focus. But I was surprised at how broadly the game has been used in a whole range of subjects, not just climate change and environmental science, and not just other sciences like physics, chemistry, and beyond the sciences, also in geography, philosophy, media studies, English, math. So it's really any subject where there's misinformation, the game and critical thinking is relevant, and every subject has misinformation.
I know it really is, like you said, kind of ubiquitous and becoming quite an epidemic of its own sort, really. Is there any way to, like, how do you measure the effects of something like this? It must
So
be
we
kind of
measure it in,
hard.
well, it's a good question because we've struggled with this. In the Cranky Uncle original game, we call it Cranky Classic. We measured critical thinking by showing people misinforming statements and then asking them how did the misinformation, or how did this statement mislead? And then we would have like four different sentences saying it was cherry picking, it was demanding impossible expectations, quite quite a mouthful, like quite a lot of text for people to read. And so we recently launched the Cranky Uncle vaccine game, and we streamlined our research. Now we just show them a single sentence statement and ask them to rate how true or false they think it is. And so they're both factual statements, vaccine facts, and fallacy statements. So a a false like vaccine myth, and we're measuring how believable they find each statement. And we do that at the start of the game and at the end of the game. What we hope to see is that belief in vaccine facts go up and belief in vaccine myths go down. We want to see discernment increase. So being able to discern between facts and misinformation.
Very, very
And
cool.
and spoiler alert, we do see an increase in discernment. So belief in the case of the vaccine game, belief in vaccine facts went up, and belief in the vaccine misinformation went down.
I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit more here. Like, how do you know you're not, like, I think if you have Cranky Uncle as the game and going into it, like people know that it's about kind of educating for that critical thinking. Like, what do you do for those kind of like conspiracy believers that might completely like throw that out the wash from the beginning? You know, just when we were talking about breaking down silos and being able to meet people where they're at, I'm just curious as to, I guess in like a classroom, you kind of have like a bit more, like everyone is doing the same program. It's just part of the program, which is great. But I think like, for example, like just like let's say outside of the classroom, like how to kind of catch people that are not in an education setting. Because a vast number of us are not anymore, right? So I'm
Yeah.
curious as to what that looks like.
And that's what we're doing with the vaccine game. We're not targeting teachers. It really is about public outreach and promoting it to social media, promoting it to different interest groups, youth, parents, people who have different attitudes about vaccines that we're trying to I guess improve acceptance of vaccines. And so yeah, we do see similar patterns both in the classroom setting with Cranky Classic and in a public setting with the vaccine game. Probably the most startling statistic from our vaccine research is among the people who at the start of the game said that they didn't intend to get vaccinated, we found that by the time those people got to the end of the game, 58% of them had changed their minds to being accepting of vaccines. So yeah, we are seeing not only that increase in discernment between facts and misinformation, but also seeing a shift in their attitudes. And that's really ultimately what we're wanting to see.
Yeah, that's great. That must feel so satisfying to be able to do something that can have such positive impact on such a larger scale than just having like a conversation over and over and over again, which I'm sure would be very, very
Yeah.
tiring. So
I mean,
let's sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say satisfying, yes, but also as a scientist, relief.
Yes, I'm
Because
sure.
you invest a lot of effort and a lot of resources and other people working on this intervention, and then you test it to see whether it works. And scientists design a lot of experiments, implement them, and often or sometimes you just get null results. You see no shift. So the stakes are raised when you're creating an intervention that requires so much work and so many resources to implement this out in the field. So yes, satisfied but also relieved when we saw those
Yeah.
good results.
Yeah, I'm sure. So before we get into the five categories, I'd love to know, was there any other piece of like feedback that was really surprising? Like any other learnings that really kind of went counter to what you expected?
That's a good question. Okay, yeah, the thing that most surprised us with both the classic game and the vaccine game, and it's so surprising I still don't understand it, is that the game, and when I talk to people, I say, you got any theories? And hoping that someone can suggest something that we could then test. We found that the game had its biggest impact on improving people's discernment on older players.
On what, sorry?
We on older players compared
On
to
older
younger players.
players. Oh, interesting.
We we expected that younger players would show the biggest improvement. And while everyone showed improvement, there was a more pronounced improvement amongst older players. And it's even more surprising because often the older players started at a higher level of discernment than the younger players. But then their
Oh,
discernment got even bigger and they pulled away from younger people. So they just seem to be getting more out of the game than younger players.
interesting. And I wonder if that's like kind of something possibly to do with how mature our brain is when it meets this kind of content. I don't know, just kind of
Yeah,
musing.
yeah, mature or level of engagement. Maybe the younger people are engaging with the game at a shallower level.
Yeah,
We're
maybe you need
actually
to put more like
designing.
Taylor Swift in there or something, you know?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Get some. Actually, my daughter was texting me yesterday asking about some Taylor Swift logical fallacies. She was saying, "Here's an
Yeah,
argument Taylor Swift made. What fallacy is this?" So yeah, maybe we could get some of that kind of stuff into the game.
that'd be funny. If I saw that, I would be like, oh, there it is. That's great.
Although,
Okay.
we have had some pushback from people when we point out fallacies in misinformation that they believe. And I imagine if we started pointing out Taylor Swift fallacies, probably getting the Swifties onto us might be a dangerous ground to get into.
Yeah, you better paint her in a really positive light. Okay, so let's run through the five because I think it'd be good for our listeners to be able to take that away with them. And it's an acronym, FLICC, FLICC. If you could run through each one and give me kind of like your favorite example of it, I think that could be good.
Sure. So the Flick fallacy summarized the 5 techniques of science denial. And Flick stands for fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. And then an important point to make is that these 5 techniques are actually more like categories. They're not just single techniques, because we do see lots of sub-techniques underneath it. Underneath cherry picking, you would have anecdote or quote mining or like different flavors of cherry picking. Under logical fallacies, there are a whole family of logical fallacies, whether it's false dichotomies, oversimplification, ad hominem attacks. And yeah, so there is actually a big family of arguments, but Flick is a very effective way to organize them and make sense of the different techniques. As for what my favorite fallacy is, it's a good question. Favorite in the sense that I like I like to debunk them, or they're easier to explain.
I meant kind
Um,
of more like for every subcategory. Like, what's your favorite way to explain fake experts? What's like the easiest or like most fun way to explain a logical fallacy?
yeah. So I, when I was doing really getting my feet wet on critical thinking, I was working with some critical thinking philosophers at the University of Queensland, and they introduced me to a technique for explaining logical fallacies, which they said was one of the more effective techniques. The philosophers, they call it parallel argumentation. Another word for it or phrase for it is logic analogies. Basically, take the flawed logic in an argument or the fallacy and then transplant it into a parallel situation or an analogous situation. And this is my favorite way of explaining fallacies. And let me give you an example.
Yeah, I definitely
The,
need
ar-
that.
the argument that cold weather disproves that global warming exists, that's the same logic as saying that nighttime proves that the sun doesn't exist. They
Yeah.
both commit anecdote fallacy. It's only looking at your immediate experience in that instant in time, in that place where you're standing, and ignoring what's the bigger picture. Another
Sure.
version of that argument, cold weather disproves global warming, is saying, I just had a meal and I'm feeling full, therefore global hunger doesn't exist.
Right. It definitely reduces it into some like very crazy, silly thing. It also
Yeah.
requires a bit of pure creativity, though. Kind of really showcase to people, like, wait, but like that's what your mind is actually doing. Like, do you see the issue now?
Yeah, and I think the creativity is actually why it's so powerful, because people often react the way you did, just laugh because it's a ridiculous argument, but it's exactly the same logic as the original climate myth. And it's a very concrete, relatable, and engaging and humorous way to debunk misinformation. The light bulb moment for me was realizing that this technique is used by late night comedians every night. They debunk something that a public figure said by saying, well, that's just like being in this situation. And then they use the same logic in an analogous situation. And everyone laughs. It's funny, it's entertaining, but it also explains how the original argument was false.
I love that. Yeah, and that's definitely one of the topics I wanted to cover with you about humor, and you kind of answer it, like how to make climate change funny. It sounds like it really is just about using this kind of technique that, like you said, comedians have been using. Is there any other way do you find to make, climate change and the impending end of the earth funny?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are different styles of humor, and we ran a study once where this is with some researchers based in Utah and a couple of different places in the US who were fascinated with different types of humor. So like, there is satire, which is what this parallel argumentation is. You're basically satirizing the original climate myth. There's also anthropomorphism. So take inanimate objects and then give them personality. That's often a way to make something more engaging, like take an Earth and give it eyeballs and arms and legs and personality, and Earth's kind of complaining about global warming. So that's a nice way to use humor to explain abstract concepts to people. And what else did we have? Oh, that's right. They called it wordplay, but it's basically dad jokes. Like take words, use double meanings, or just puns, or that kind of thing. So we tested different types of humor, but yeah, nothing really jumped out like that. At least in the experiments we did, all the different humor effects were effective, but no one style jumped out, at least in our experiments. But like any scientist, more research needs to be done.
And wouldn't that be a fun project to be like collaborating with comedians who test out material and then you get to test out an audience and see who's the funniest?
Yeah,
I
I have
love that.
spoke to stand-up comedians about trying to wrap some science around their humor, but haven't quite managed to pull it off yet. I even once cyberstalked one of the writers from Stephen Colbert's writers team. Like I found out the list of writers, found one on Twitter, direct messaged him, and was curious about their process in developing parallel arguments. Did they have a systematic way of doing it? And he wouldn't tell me. He was like,
Oh,
it's almost like a trade secret kind of thing. Didn't want to kind of, reveal the wizard behind the curtain kind of thing. But then later, I met someone who worked in Jon Stewart's writer's room, and he confirmed my suspicions, which was people just throw stuff on the wall and then they just pick what works. So I don't think there is a systematic way to generate humor, or you can't, there's no paint by numbers way to be creative. I think that the creative process by and large is kind of individual and spontaneous.
yeah, and messy. Like if it was, like there's a difference between paint by numbers and something that you create without that kind of pre-formulaic way, right? I think
Yeah,
creativity is
exactly.
kind of the ability to kind of like really think beyond the formulaic. So I can understand why comedy seen as an art form would definitely kind of follow along that trajectory. Okay. The last thing well, two last things really I want to cover with you. I think we have enough time. Is that I really loved the kind of aspect of your work, at least highlighted in the Persuaders, was that you really come at misinformation from this perspective of kind of, from what I perceive as like ending kind of this idea of like divisiveness, where it's like, oh, those dummies that have fallen for misinformation. It's a much more gracious attitude of like, you're an intelligent human being, you don't deserve to be fooled, and here's how, and it's not your fault. And I'm curious to know how you got to that point, because I think it's kind of an easy pitfall, especially in this age of call out culture and kind of being so quick to kind of call the other person wrong. I'm curious to know how you kind of came to that perspective.
I think that the data actually just kind of pushed me in that direction. When I did my first psych experiment testing inoculation approaches, what I found was this critical thinking approach, explaining misleading fallacies, was equally effective across the political spectrum. It neutralized the misinformation, whether people were politically conservative or politically liberal. And it really underscored to me how nobody likes being misled, whether you're
Mhm.
conservative or liberal, whether you're Republican or Democrat. And the critical thinking approach also gave you the opportunity to kind of sidestep culturally charged issues like climate
Mhm.
change, which is very polarized. You can use these parallel arguments, use these different examples of fallacies in a completely non-polarizing situation, and then that inoculates them against those techniques. What my first experiment found was when I explained the technique of fake experts using tobacco misinformation from the mid 20th century, a much less polarized topic than really ancient history topic from a 2020 point of view. Then I showed them climate misinformation. The climate misinformation was neutralized for both conservatives and liberals. So I managed to do an inoculation in a non-polarizing way by just sidestepping the climate change issue. And so that I guess that data is what opened my eyes to critical thinking is really powerful here. It's not just an approach to stopping climate misinformation. It's really a universal vaccine against misinformation.
Yeah, I really love that. That's really wonderful. Okay, so my last question actually is that a lot, I think, the basis of your work was founded on your own personal lived experience. That I think it was some of your family members who had started off not believing in climate science and were struggling with this misinformation. I'm curious to know, how does the story end? Or maybe the story is ongoing. How is that? Have they kind of
Yeah,
taken to your work?
the story is ongoing and the story never
Yeah.
ends, right? That's the theme of the day. Yeah, so I mentioned starting the website Skeptical Science earlier, but I didn't say why. It actually, the impetus for starting Skeptical Science was getting into arguments with my father-in-law about climate change. And like any son-in-law that doesn't want to lose an argument with their father-in-law, I started researching the topic, documenting, because I'm also a nerd, all the different climate myths that I might encounter the next time we got together and what the peer-reviewed science said about each climate myth so I could have a ready-made answer. And then I realized that this kind of resource is something that might be useful to anyone. That led to me publishing my research on skeptical science. I also had similar arguments with my father as well. So both father and father-in-law were having these climate arguments. And interestingly, both of those conversations have gone in different directions. My
Okay.
father ended up changing his mind and accepting the reality of climate change and human-caused global warming. My father-in-law hasn't. He's like very much doubled down and distrustful, dismissive of climate science. And so I think that what that tells us is that again, it's not a cookie cutter thing. There is no one path. There is no killer argument that will change anyone's minds. Everyone is different, and every conversation we have with a person can go in different ways. The thing that changed my father's mind about climate change wasn't some killer argument that I had or a killer fact that blew his mind away. Or, and I was doing a PhD about climate misinformation at the time that we were talking about this and he changed his mind. What changed his mind was him getting solar panels. He
Mm.
in the region where he lives, Queensland, Australia, they had a very generous solar rebate so that whenever he put solar power back into the grid, he got more money than he was paying for solar power, paying for electricity. And because Queensland, which is called the Sunshine State, was giving him so much solar power, he was basically not paying any electricity bill. He was getting a check from rather than a bill every time that he got a letter from the electricity company. And so every 3 months when he got the electricity bill, he would call me up and say, guess how much I got, how much money I got this time. And and my theory is that what changed his mind about climate change was not his beliefs changing first and then his behavior changing. Rather, his behavior changed first for hip pocket reasons, as he liked to tell me, and then his beliefs shifted to come in line with his behavior. We always think that beliefs come first and then behavior. It can go in
Mm.
either direction, and I think in his case, it went in in the other direction. But
But
I
in
think
this
yeah, go ahead.
But in this situation, it sounds like, was it the government that was kind of stimulating that behavior? Yeah.
Exactly. The government were
Uh-huh.
trying to encourage the public to install solar power on their roofs. And that tells us the importance of incentives. That you need governments to support climate action and there's a whole range of different tools that they can provide, removing barriers, providing incentives, just making it easier and more attractive for people to act in more environmentally friendly ways.
Yeah, that's so wonderful that it happened that way, and I'm sure that maybe makes your relationship a bit more easeful as well. But then what do we do when the government is actually part of the kind of crazy machine that is spewing misinformation because they're, kind of gaining from the fossil fuel industry, which is something that we encounter in Canada. So that's kind of a trickier thing, at least localized for us.
It's really hard, especially when the government is a source of misinformation, because the one of the biggest predictors or drivers of public opinion about climate change is what we researchers call elite cues. In other words, what we hear from our political leaders. Humans are
Mm.
very tribal animals. We
Hmm.
follow our tribal leaders. And so when our leaders are telling us climate change is a hoax or climate change is real and we need to act, people follow those cues. They have strong influence on people's opinions. And so when the government is the source of misinformation, then that is really difficult to push against because it's such a influential factor.
Yeah. Are there any kind of hints in your research as to what to do then?
Yeah, so and this is the challenge. See, we need to be able to develop interventions to counter misinformation at scale. So I think that we just need to be throwing everything at it. We need to be getting more critical thinking and education so that the next generation is learning how to spot this misinformation. We need to be, as citizens, calling out and pushing back against misinformation whenever we see it, whether it's on
Mhm.
social media or conversations or writing letters to newspapers or, calling out misinformation if we see it on TV. So all those things matter, and we need to be building momentum. Probably the biggest thing, the biggest principle that we as citizens need to be aware of is, or the biggest thing we can do to contribute to this issue is just open our mouths and talk about it. Just let people know that we care about this issue and build awareness of the issue. The most dangerous thing is climate silence because
Mm.
it sends the signal that people don't care about climate change. A lot of people do care about it, but we need to let everyone know. Me telling my dad that I care about climate change probably had just as much influence as any of the climate facts or critical thinking arguments I made because I was sending a social signal that I
Right.
cared about it. And social signals matter as well.
That's so true, isn't it? That so much of how relationships go and dynamics go, it comes down to some emotional level of kind of belonging and a sense of community as well. Okay, so one more thing that I picked up on in your chapter was that if you don't simplify, and this is maybe I might have butchered your saying, so you can recapsulate it if you need. Kind of a perfect case in point. If you don't simplify kind of your body of work, then somebody else will for you. Was that you?
Yeah, no, you
Kind
did
of.
do a good job of, yeah, ironic if you got it wrong, but no, you did get it right. That's actually a quote from Ed Mayback.
Okay.
And Ed Mayback just over the last month was reading the same book, The
Oh,
Persuaders
that's
by
funny.
and said, "Oh wow, I didn't expect to see me in the book." From me
Yeah.
quoting him about the simplify thing.
Oh.
Yeah, so he's obviously one of the world's like leading climate communicators, Ed Mayback, and that statement that he made really stuck with me
Hmm.
because, and I've experienced it too. Like we've published the research, and then other people run with it and mangle it. So I think that scientists need to be proactive in making sure that the way they communicate their science is simple and clear and repeatable, so that
Yeah.
so that they make it easy for other people to repeat the key findings of their research without getting it wrong. And scientists kind of shy away from that in a way because they fear oversimplifying their research.
Hmm.
But simplifying isn't what I talk about when I say simplify your research isn't oversimplifying it. It's about boiling down the core idea of your research to what is that core idea? What is that one concept that you want to communicate? And and then communicate that in a simple, sticky way.
So what do you want our listeners' sticky takeaway to be from this conversation of many kind of loose threads in a big nest.
If you remember, because we've thrown out a lot of ideas. So if you can remember one thing, it would be, I'll give you a case study of this idea of sticky science communication
Yeah,
and
go for
this
it.
one sticky fact. In 2013, we published a paper where we analyzed climate papers published in scientific journals in order to find out, was there a consensus on human-caused global warming? Did climate papers agree that humans were causing global warming, or was there still an ongoing debate? And in our paper, we published lots of graphs and tables and lots of different results. But when we communicated the results, we boiled it down to one key statistic, just a single number. We communicated that 97% of climate papers stating a position on human-caused global warming agreed that humans were causing global warming. So there was 97% consensus on human-caused global warming. And communicating that sticky single statistic ended up being what other people repeated afterwards, and it went viral. In fact, the day after the paper came out, back in 2013, President Obama tweeted the 97% consensus, and then his tweet led to a cascading, wave of attention for that research. And I think that's putting that effort in to identify the sticky facts that summarized our research played a significant part in the research going viral.
Yeah, and I even think of it as like part of the creative process. Like here you are making something that gets so, so, so big, and then you're refining it again to something so, so, so kind of like so simple and clear. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. I don't know if there's anything I missed that you want to share.
Well, we covered a lot, so no,
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
I think we're
Okay,
all
well,
good.
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much again for sharing your time and your wisdom with me. I really enjoyed our conversation and look forward to seeing what else you get up to.
My pleasure. It was great to talk to you.
All right. Thanks so much.
Hi everyone, Connor Curtis, Head of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, jumping in here to do the Q&A. Before I get into the Q&A, I just want to say that was a really great interview. I've actually used skeptical science as a resource for years encountering misinformation, and I want to say thank you to John for all the work on that and everybody else on that team. And I might add that I have used that resource in places where there was a lot of misinformation and it was very hard to fight it, and in situations where there was a lot of lies being spread about a particular issue. I think that it's interesting we talk about the backfire effect and that not really being a thing, because I've used skeptical science in a lot of places practically that it is helpful to counter misinformation. I've not personally witnessed the backfire effect. What I have seen is backfiring happening more around framing of an issue, right? When we focus too much on individual responsibility versus systemic change that needs to happen in terms of climate action, that can cause a backfire because people feel guilty. They feel like they're to blame individually for climate change, and that's just not the case. And the other time I've seen the backfire effect happen is when we don't call out corporations for their part of the blame for climate inaction, because when we say that, oh, well, it's just the fault of us collectively somehow, but we don't actually say, well, there's a bad actor that's been holding back progress, then that can also cause a backfire effect because people feel helpless. So for me, at least in my experience, backfiring has less to do with using facts or not using facts, but more to do with how we frame our discussions around those facts, and being important to understand where people are coming from individually, as we're about to get into in the Q&A today, talking a little bit about, what is the difference if you live in a rural area and you need a rural vehicle, and if you live in a city and you need a city vehicle, right? Understanding these differences between each other in a practical way, and just never punching down, I think, is an important thing to do and sort of helps with that. But so anyway, I found this interview really interesting, and that's just something I wanted to add as somebody who has used one of John's resources for a long period of time. And so we've talked a lot recently about the efforts of the oil and gas industry to stall climate action. And in response, somebody wrote in to say the following: the motor vehicle companies are also part of the problem. Most do not advertise their hybrids and electric vehicles. they've had these available for 14 years for some companies, yet only in the last 2 have kept any in stock at dealerships or even mentioned them in advertising. I am sure you know that in Manitoba in the 1940s, researchers worked out a motor that ran on 70 miles per gallon. Of course, they were brought out by an American company that did not want such an efficient motor. And so I can't speak to the history there in Manitoba or that specific incident, but I can talk to this as a general trend. In one case, yes, we have seen a general trend in motor vehicle companies to sell larger and larger vehicles when they are not necessary for people that they're selling them to. Again, it's not to say that in certain rural areas you might not need a larger vehicle. That's quite possible. But in a city, there's not as much need for that. And we've seen, despite that, a reduction in the number of options available for smaller vehicles. And this is a big problem because, again, smaller vehicles do have better mileage, are more efficient, are better for being in a city, and quite frankly cost you less as a vehicle owner than a much larger vehicle does. So there's a lot of issues there. I think when we speak specifically about the electric thing, what we've seen in the last few years are government regulations coming into place to force motor vehicle companies to start investing in electric vehicles in a serious way with an actual mandates for transition. We've seen this in Europe particularly as sort of a leader in this mandated transition to electric vehicles. And that has forced them to finally start doing some of this. Again, it's going to be a while before that capacity is necessarily up to the same level as it is for gas vehicles, but there is an actual shift happening. I think that if anything, that speaks to the importance of government policy enforcing forward these changes, because companies can't just be relied upon to do this themselves. Of course, we know that electric vehicles are not the only part of the green transition. We know we need to see further investment in things like public transport, in things like better rail networks, and things like connectivity within communities so that people don't have to go as far. And that's true of rural communities as well as of large centers. We have seen for years now rural communities suffer from a lack of funding, from a lack of ability to build up capacity locally for things, and people do have to travel more for that reason. People have to travel for work further away. And that all ties into vehicle use and people having to buy vehicles much more often than they would normally because, again, there's wear and tear on any vehicle. And people are buying sometimes larger vehicles because there just isn't the option available to buy a smaller one. A lot of people, too, are not looking to buy a new vehicle. They are looking to buy a second-hand vehicle. It's hopeful that in the next few years we will start to see more and more electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles on the second-hand market for people. That will give them cheaper options for those. But I will say it is something that is a struggle for a lot of people who want a second-hand vehicle to find something that is smaller. That's becoming harder and harder to find. Again, vehicles have become larger and larger, and this is, from what I've been able to tell, mostly an artificially generated demand. It doesn't actually have to do with what people necessarily want, but we've had a lot of advertising campaigns to try to convince people that you need a larger vehicle when perhaps you don't. Again, there's the rural exception here. When you live in a smaller place and you have traditional practices that maybe are very different than somebody in a city, you might own a larger vehicle. So as well, when we see the shift to electrics, we need to start seeing the shift to a wide range of electric vehicles that are available to everybody that have good mileage, that are actually very efficient. But definitely there needs to be an impetus on these companies for a lot of the demand, which is going to be city focused, to produce smaller electric and hybrid vehicles that have good efficiency, that are very well made, and that are things that people can actually rely upon. I think that is coming. I think that we're a long way towards that, but again, this only happens when there are government mandates to make it happen. So thank you for the question. I hope this answers it a bit or contributes to it. And before we go today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.